Ryan Reynolds here from Mint Mobile with a message for everyone paying big wireless way too much. Please, for the love of everything good in this world, stop. With Mint, you can get premium wireless for just $15 a month. Of course, if you enjoy overpaying, no judgments, but that's weird. Okay, one judgment. Anyway, give it a try at mintmobile.com/switch.
Upfront payment of $45 for 3-month plan, equivalent to $15 per month required. Intro rate first 3 months only, then full price plan options available. Taxes and fees extra. See full terms at mintmobile.com.
At T-Mobile, our critical mission is providing unparalleled 5G coverage for when connectivity is mission critical. Introducing T-Priority, America's best 5G network experience for first responders, even in times of congestion. More capacity, faster speeds, better coverage. T-Priority from T-Mobile, built for tomorrow's emergencies, ready today. Discover more at t-priority.com.
For qualifying organizations on eligible rate plans, coverage not available in some areas and may be impacted by emergencies.
Good night, itchy eyes. Good night, sudden sneeze. Good night to your symptoms of allergies. Xyzal is the allergy medicine you take before bed. It provides powerful relief while you rest your head. Not just all night, but all the next day. Xyzal keeps working, keeping allergies at bay. And without those annoying symptoms disturbing your rest, you can wake up the next morning feeling your absolute best. Remember, be wise all. Take Xyzal. At night.
EVO. This series contains adult language and depictions of graphic violence. Listener discretion is advised. It began, as many things do, with a city. For Dante Alighieri, that city was Florence, Italy, a place of shifting power and constant intrigue, where narrow streets wound like veins through a body pulsing with trade, art, and ambition. The Arno River, at times gentle and at others raging, carried the lifeblood of commerce past great palaces and humble workshops. It was here, amid the towering stone churches and bustling markets, that Dante Alighieri, known to the world as Dante, first drew breath in the year 1265. His was a family of noble but declining means, an old name without the riches to match its legacy. His father, Alighiero de Bellencione, was a man of business and modest standing, unremarkable in all but his ability to keep his affairs steady in a time when the wrong alliance could mean exile or ruin. His mother, Bella degli Abate, died when Dante was still a child, leaving him with a yearning for a love that he would spend his life seeking, though perhaps never quite finding. In those twisting alleyways of Florence, where the cobblestones held the echoes of poets and artists and preachers, Dante grew. He was a boy of keen eyes and even sharper wit, drawn not to the rough games of his peers, but to the endless rhythm of words, the architecture of language itself. He listened in the piazzas where orators spoke of politics and war, absorbing the cadence of their conviction. He lingered in the churches, not only for the sermons, but for the stories hidden in the flickering light of the frescoes. It was in these early years, when boyhood had not yet given way to youth, that Dante first saw Beatrice Portinari. She was, by all accounts, unremarkable to the world, but to him, she was everything. She wore a crimson dress, her hair the color of ripened wheat in the Tuscan sun. She turned her gaze toward him but once, and in that moment, he was lost. Love for Dante was never a matter of possession or of exchange. It was divine, the thread between mortal longing and celestial grace. He would scarcely speak to Beatrice in life, but he would write her into eternity. The world of Florence, however, was not one of poetry alone. It was a city of factions, divided between the Guelphs and the Ghibellines, between loyalty to the Pope and loyalty to the Holy Roman Emperor. Even as a young man, Dante understood that the battle for power was waged not only with swords, but with words. And he chose his allegiance carefully. The Guelphs prevailed, but their victory was a temporary illusion, for soon they would splinter into white and black factions, and Dante, ever principled, would find himself caught in the tide. For now, though, he was a boy with a head full of verse, walking through the city that would one day reject him, not yet knowing that Florence's loss would be humanity's gain. Welcome back to The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow. You're listening to Episode 5, Anger. In the cool, cloistered halls of Florence's schools, where the scent of ink and parchment mingled with the dust of old stone, Dante's mind expanded. He was drawn to the works of Boethius, Cicero, and Ovid, whose words ignited in him a passion for philosophy and the art of expression. But no name resonated with him as profoundly as that of Virgil, the Roman master whose epic, the Aeneid, sang of fate, of duty, and the journey of a man through realms both earthly and divine. It was Virgil's balance of grandeur and precision that Dante absorbed like sacred scripture. Under the guidance of Florence's most learned men, including Brunetto Latini, he refined his grasp of rhetoric and poetics. Latini, a scholar and statesman, recognized something in Dante that others might have overlooked: an intensity of thought, a restlessness of spirit, a hunger for something beyond the mere realities of civic life. The pen, Latini once told him, is as mighty as the sword, but more enduring. A warrior may win a battle, but a poet may win eternity. Dante took those words to heart, committing himself to the delicate task of crafting beauty from language. And yet his education was not confined to books. He studied life itself, walking the length of Florence's streets, listening to the rhythm of the people, their arguments in the marketplace, their prayers in the churches, their songs in the taverns. He saw both the virtue and the vice of man, the towering heights of human reason and the depths of folly and sin. By the time Dante reached his 20s, Florence had grown more divided than ever. The Guelphs, to whom his family owed allegiance, had triumphed over the Ghibellines, securing papal authority in Tuscany. But as stated, that peace in Florence was an illusion, because soon the Guelphs themselves were split into white and black factions. The white Guelphs, who sought greater independence from the Pope, and the black Guelphs, who remained loyal to papal authority. Dante aligned himself with the whites, believing that Florence should not be a pawn of Rome, but a beacon of its own destiny. He entered political life, serving in councils and embassies, debating fiercely, crafting laws. Words had been his passion, but now they were also his weapon. And yet, as much as he fought for the future of Florence, he didn't see the shadow creeping upon him. And even as Florence's turmoil deepened, Dante carried within him a love untouched by politics, a love that had begun with a glance on a Florentine street and would one day shape the greatest poem of all time. Beatrice Portinari remained his muse and his celestial guide. Though she had long since married another, Dante loved her in a way that required no reciprocation. When news reached him in 1290 that Beatrice had died before reaching the age of 30, the earth beneath him seemed to shift. The streets of Florence, once familiar, now felt foreign. He withdrew into philosophy, searching for meaning in the works of Aquinas and Aristotle, questioning the nature of the soul, the purpose of suffering, and the path to the divine. If love could be taken away in life, could it be restored in death? Dante found solace in writing, crafting the Vita Nuova, a collection of poetry and prose that immortalized Beatrice in verse. But even as he honored her with words, he knew that something greater awaited him. The world of Florence was too small for the vision he carried. One day, he would not only write of love, but of the universe itself, of sin, of redemption, and of the vast eternal order of things. Dante's rise in politics brought power, but also danger. In 1302, when the Black Guelphs seized control of Florence with the backing of Pope Boniface VIII, Dante, a known white Guelph, was condemned. Charged with corruption and treason, he was sentenced to exile under pain of death, never to return to the city of his birth. It was on the road, as he wandered through Italy, bereft of home and title, that Dante Alighieri began to shape his ultimate masterpiece. He had lost Florence, but he had gained something far greater. A vision of eternity that his teacher had spoken of. With nothing left but his words, he began to write. A journey through the afterlife, a descent into hell, a climb through purgatory, and a glimpse into paradise. And so began the work that would grant him immortality, the Divine Comedy. If Dante's character, ambition, and ultimate contribution to society was formed by his father, his teacher, and the great love of his life, Beatrice, we can say that Richard Ramirez was heavily influenced by his father and two other older men in his life, his cousin Mike and his brother-in-law Roberto. We're not exactly sure when the beatings began or how severe they were at first. Ramirez had said his father would, quote, beat the shit out of me, starting when he was, quote, a little kid. The beatings would be random and mostly without cause. And the abuse wasn't only physical. When his dad found out that Richard would sometimes escape the violence of the home by hiding in a nearby cemetery, his father punished him by tying him to a cross in the middle of the graveyard and leaving him overnight. He was 10 years old. It was around this time that Richard's drug and alcohol abuse began. And on top of all of that, a simple childhood accident caused potentially the worst damage of all. Richard, as a rambunctious 10-year-old, was chasing or being chased through the house when he turned a corner at top speed and ran straight into an open cabinet door head first. He was knocked unconscious. This was the first of several head injuries that medical professionals would later claim contributed to, or actually caused, Ramirez to become a made psychopath. By the age of 12, Ramirez, desperate for a father figure that didn't abuse and humiliate him, began to spend most of his time with his older cousin, Mike Vallis. Mike was 23 years old and had a 5-year-old son with his wife, Jessie. He was also a Vietnam War veteran and a murderous fiend of the highest order. Mike Vallis was a highly trained killer in the U.S. Army, a Green Beret who saw significant action in the jungles of Southeast Asia, and his time in country was the stuff of nightmares. While fighting a very unpopular war, Mike became a serial rapist and murderer and documented his crimes with a Polaroid camera. When he came home to El Paso and found in young Richard Ramirez an acolyte who looked up to him and who listened to his gruesome, boastful stories of his exploits during the war without judgment, but rather with fascination. Mike even shared his prized photographs with the adolescent Ramirez. Photos of young Vietnamese women tied to trees, nude, ravaged, murdered. Some dismembered, others decapitated. Mike Vallis would never answer for these crimes. As Mike and Richard's relationship grew, Mike began to teach Richard many of the skills he had learned as a Green Beret. Richard learned how to stalk, how to surveil. He learned urban combat tactics, methods of torture, how to kill with a knife, with a gun, with his bare hands. All the skills a serial killer would need in the City of Angels. On April 22, 1973, a small gas leak in the home that Mike shared with his wife and son, Miguel Jr., led to an explosion that claimed the life of the little boy. With the family in obvious crisis, Richard needed to spend time away from Mike and found himself a job as a bellboy at the Holiday Inn in El Paso. He was 14 years old. Naturally, with a burgeoning drug habit to feed that now included near-daily LSD use, Richard used his master key to burglarize hotel rooms while occupants slept. It's also been reported that on at least 2 occasions, Ramirez molested young girls in the hotel elevator. But one day he decided to take things up a notch. He noticed a couple in their 20s lounging by the pool and familiarized himself with their patterns. When he knew the woman would be going back to the room alone, he let himself in and hid in the bathroom. When she arrived, he pounced and attempted to overpower her with the intent of raping her. But much to his surprise, the woman's boyfriend arrived shortly after and gave Ramirez a serious beating before calling the police and having him arrested. The charges would be dropped when the couple decided not to return to El Paso to testify in open court. It was also during this time that the first signs of an interest in Satanism appeared, again introduced to Richard by his cousin Mike. Less than a year later, on May 4th, 1975, 15-year-old Richard Ramirez was back at his cousin Mike's house when he witnessed what began as an argument between Mike and his wife Jessie. The fight quickly escalated, and Mike pulled out a .38 revolver and shot his wife in the face, killing her instantly. Ramirez would claim that blood splatter covered his face and body, and again, rather than being repulsed, he found himself intrigued. Upon arrest, law enforcement would realize that Mike Vallis had received a 100% disability rating when he was discharged from the military, a distinction owing to the acute case of PTSD that Mike was suffering from due to the horrors of war he had experienced in Vietnam. As a result, he was found not guilty of murder of his wife by reason of insanity, and rather than be sent to jail, he was institutionalized. When Mike went away, Richard became lonely and sullen. He dropped out of high school before the end of 9th grade and was in need of another role model. This time, it was his brother-in-law, Roberto. Ramirez moved in with his older sister and her husband, Roberto. And while definitely not worse than cousin Mike, Roberto's influence was about as equally destructive when it came to shaping the worldview of a future serial killer. You see, Roberto himself was a serial peeping Tom and began inviting Richard along on his nightly rounds. From Roberto, Richard learned how to move in the darkness, how to stay out of sight, and how to keep his eye open for possible targets. In 1977, when cousin Mike was released from a psychiatric hospital after only 2 years, the three of them, Richard, now 17 and a high school dropout, Roberto, a full-time peeping Tom, and cousin Mike, a serial murderer with acute PTSD, this motley crew would stalk the residential communities of El Paso, all the while discussing disturbing sexual fantasies, hatred of women, the intoxicating feeling of strength and power while committing violence, and it was all the byproduct of pure, seething rage. Ramirez took away a valuable lesson. His anger was his power. His rage was his friend. His wrath was his deliverer.
This episode is brought to you by Greenlight. Get this. Adults with financial literacy skills have 82% more wealth than those who don't. From swimming lessons to piano classes, us parents invest in so many things to enrich our kids' lives. But are we investing in their future financial success? With Greenlight, you can teach your kids financial literacy skills like earning, saving, and investing. And this investment costs less than that after-school treat. Start prioritizing their financial education and future today with a risk-free trial at greenlight.com/Spotify. Greenlight.com/Spotify.
This podcast is supported by Progressive, a leader in RV insurance. RVs are for sharing adventures with family, friends, and even your pets. So if you bring your cats and dogs along for the ride, you'll want Progressive RV insurance. They protect your cats and dogs like family by offering up to $1,000 in optional coverage for vet bills in case of an RV accident, making it a great companion for the responsible pet owner who loves to travel. See Progressive's other benefits and more when you quote RV insurance at Progressive.com today. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Pet injury is an additional coverage and subject to policy terms.
TaxAct knows small business owners can sometimes use a little help with their taxes. That's why TaxAct has Expert Assist, a team of live tax experts ready to answer any questions you may have. Think of them as your own personal sidekick. Not like one of those funny talking animal sidekicks, more like the super smart nerding out on tax code and business casual attire sidekick, but just as helpful and lovable. TaxAct. Let's get them over with.
Bring on your business challenges, the complex ones, the ones that seem to change every day, the ones that are so nuanced no one else could possibly understand them. Bring them all on. Key has a team of banking experts specialized in your industry, always ready to take your call and offer trusted solutions. And we go even further, staying ahead of trends so that you have answers before you even knew you needed them. Bring on your business challenges. Key Bank opens doors. Learn more at key.com/B2B.
As Dante and Virgil journey deeper into the infernal abyss of hell, they arrive at the Stygian Marsh, also known as the River Styx, the domain of the wrathful and the sullen, souls damned to suffer for eternity in the fifth circle. The murky waters stretch endlessly before them, a putrid, churning expanse beneath the ashen sky. The air is thick with a foul stench, heavy with the weight of endless rage and silent despair. The wrathful, who spent their mortal lives consumed by anger and violence, now writhe and clash upon the surface of the dark waters. They're locked in perpetual combat, clawing, biting, and striking out at one another with unrelenting fury. Their voices rise in guttural cries, an eternal cacophony of hatred and vengeance. Bloodied faces emerge and disappear beneath the waves, only to resurface moments later, their rage renewed, their torment unceasing. Beneath the surface, hidden from view, lie the sullen. Those who in life wallowed in bitterness and refused to see joy in the world. Their punishment is one of silence and suffocation, trapped beneath the mire, their bodies submerged in the blackened waters. Only the occasional bubble or faint ripple betrays their presence. Their muffled lamentations, swallowed by the swamp, form a sorrowful dirge that lingers in the thick air. Their despair is not the wailing of the damned, but the heavy burden of a sorrow too deep to be spoken. Dante turned to his guide, a question forming on his lips before hesitation stilled his tongue. It was Virgil who spoke first. These are the souls whom wrath consumed, whether in fury or in silence. They are the architects of their own misery, for they let their passions govern them instead of virtue. The wrathful feed on their own rage, and the sullen, those who turned away from the world, now sink beneath their own weight. As he listened, Dante couldn't help but recall moments in his own life when wrath had coursed through his veins, when melancholy had pressed upon his soul. He shuddered, for he saw now the final consequence of such unchecked passions. He turned his gaze outward, searching for a path beyond this forsaken river. From the shadows emerged a vessel, its shape crude yet serviceable, gliding across the vile waters. A lone figure stood within it, his face twisted with perpetual scorn, his bony fingers gripping the oar with the resentment of one who had long accepted his fate, but never his punishment. It was Phlegius, the boatman of this infernal lake, once consumed by his own wrath and life, and now bound to ferry the souls of the damned. His eyes, sunken and black with loathing, fell upon the living poet, and his expression twisted further. Another living soul who dares enter the dominion of the damned? He spat, his voice rough with eternal resentment. Virgil, unimpressed, raised his hand in command. Phlegius, we are permitted. Our passage is decreed. You shall bear us across. Phlegius muttered a curse under his breath, but bent to his duty, guiding the boat toward the bank. Dante hesitated before stepping in, feeling the vessel lurch beneath him, the weight of the dead pressing unseen upon its boards. The stench of stagnant fury clung to his skin, and as they pushed off from the shore, a figure emerged from the water. It was a bloated, spectral face, its features twisted in recognition and supplication. "You!" it croaked. "You who walk among the living, look upon me and remember!" Dante peered closer and, with a jolt, recognized the wretched soul, one who had wronged him in life, a name he had tried to forget but which still lingered, a specter from Florence. But this was no longer a man of power and cruelty. This was a desperate soul, waterlogged and grasping, pleading for recognition, for dignity, for mercy. A flicker of old resentment sparked within Dante's chest. Once, he might have sought vengeance in words or in deeds, but here, in the depths of hell, he felt something else. The cold realization that no retribution he could deliver would ever exceed the punishment already at hand. "Begone," he muttered, his voice steeled. "You are where you are meant to be." With a howl, the soul clawed at the boat, but Virgil, ever composed, reached forward and pressed him back beneath the brackish surface. The water swallowed him whole, sending forth only a brief eruption of bubbles before settling into its ceaseless churn. Dante shuddered, but Virgil placed a hand upon his shoulder. "You have done rightly. Do not let the damned trouble your heart. Their fates are sealed." They continued across the river through the fetid mists until the looming walls of the city of Dis arose before them, their iron gates gleaming with an infernal glow. Dante, though shaken, drew a breath and steeled himself for the trials yet to come. He had seen wrath in its most naked form, beheld the faces of those who had surrendered to its grip. What lay ahead would only be worse. The boat touched shore, and as Phlegius spat a final curse under his breath, Dante stepped under the blackened stone, and they set off towards the city of Dis, ready to descend further into the depths of perdition. The city of Arcadia, California, located about 15 miles northeast of downtown Los Angeles, had been, for countless generations, inhabited by the Tongva people, specifically the Gabrielino tribe. The San Gabriel Valley, where Arcadia is located, and the San Gabriel Mountains that define its northern border were both named after these original inhabitants. By the time of the California Gold Rush in the latter half of the 19th century, the 11-square-mile city had become mostly lush farmland. Soon, developers envisioned Arcadia as a wealthy suburb of the neighboring city of Pasadena, and farmland was bought up, parceled out, and city planning began in earnest. During World War II, a large tract of land that was by then the world-famous Santa Anita racetrack was used as a temporary relocation center for Japanese Americans who were forced from their home after the attack on Pearl Harbor. We covered this dark time in America's history a few episodes ago. Almost 20,000 Americans lived in what the government labeled a civilian assembly center for more than 7 months, while the permanent relocation camps were being built in other parts of the state. For those grueling months, the Asian population of Arcadia were effectively prisoners who would have rather been anywhere but there. By the 1970s, the dream of a manufactured community had been realized, with beautiful streets, with wonderful homes, shopping malls and schools, police and government and parks. Well, everything you could ask for. Then, in a strange twist of fate that could even be considered ironic, the population of Arcadia, that had been 99% white in the 1970 census, became more than 64% Asian by the 2020 census. In just 2 generations, a city that had once been the symbol of government-sanctioned prejudice toward Asians, specifically Japanese, had become a place that welcomed all members of the Asian community as a place to settle and build their lives. The freeway from downtown LA to Arcadia is called the 110. When it officially opened in December of 1940, it was called the Arroyo Seco Parkway, and it was one of the oldest freeways in the U.S. and the oldest in the western United States. It was designed to connect Los Angeles and Pasadena, and given the time period in which it was constructed, it was an absolutely beautiful piece of civil engineering. Art Deco, architectural elements, stone bridges and tunnels, and graceful, smooth cement curves, all hallmarks of the mid to late 1930s and the Works Project administration. It was a novel concept, believe it or not. It was called a, quote, limited access parkway. That meant it existed outside of the established grid of streets. This would have on-ramps and off-ramps, which totally eliminated the need for intersections and traffic lights, allowing for smoother and faster traffic flow. And until the 110 was built, no one had done that yet. This 31-mile stretch of concrete that connected Pasadena through downtown Los Angeles and terminated in San Pedro, a city on the coast in southern LA County, set the precedent for all modern freeways. I still drive the 110 every now and then, and it's kind of a strange experience. It's like going back to your old Game Boy when we're all used to modern video games. The user experience is outdated, but you can see and respect the early breakthroughs of engineering and creativity that led to our modern highway system. There are no long and graceful on-ramps. These are super short and end in near 90-degree turns to access the freeway. It's a little scary, to be honest. There are also exits from the fast lane. Yeah, left lane exit ramps onto city streets. This was a time, obviously, before they decided that that was a very terrible and dangerous idea and made right lane exits standard across the board. On the brutally hot night of July 2nd, 1985, Richard Ramirez drove his stolen Toyota out of the Skid Row neighborhood of downtown Los Angeles. He was most likely living out of this car by now, as he had checked out of the Cecil days earlier, and no records of him living anywhere else could be found. He chose, at random, the 110 freeway on this night, north towards Pasadena. And he stayed on it until it ended on Glenarm Street, and then, as Ramirez liked to do, he did something out of the ordinary for him. He got off the freeway and took surface streets the last few miles into the city of Arcadia. There's a chance that he continued north out of his way for several blocks to pick up the 210 freeway east, but that's unlikely. Once arrived in the quiet community of Arcadia, Ramirez parked his car and set off on foot, staying in the shadows. He chose a house at random, at least the first house he saw with an open window, and quietly crept inside. Asleep in her bed was 75-year-old widowed grandmother, Mary Louise Cannon. Born on a farm in nearby Downey, California in 1909, Mary graduated business school in 1935, met and married Darrell Cannon, and together they owned and operated a horse training business while they built their lives together. 2 kids and 5 granddaughters later, they retired to Arcadia, where Mary beat 2 bouts with cancer, buried her husband of almost 50 years, and was just settling into a new life, where she found herself heavily involved with a very active seniors group, at the urging of her grandkids, of course. In fact, Mary had a trip planned to Australia in the fall, a vacation she called, quote, the trip of a lifetime. Late in the morning of July 2nd, a neighbor got worried when he saw a screen had been removed from an open window of Mary's house. He knocked on the door and received no answer. A quick peek in the window revealed a house in shambles. He knew better than to go in, so he called the police. What they found would shock even the most seasoned cops on the force. In the early hours of the previous evening, Ramirez slowly crept through the house and entered the bedroom, where he found the sleeping woman. However, this time, he had no erupting sexual urges. It was pure wrath. He didn't need to see the fear in her eyes when she realized what was about to happen to her. What he did need was to act on his seething anger. He grabbed the nearest weapon he could find, a lamp. And before Mary could wake up, he savagely beat her into unconsciousness. Chances are she was already dead before he went into her kitchen and grabbed a 10-inch butcher knife. Still, he re-entered the bedroom and, for reasons known but to Ramirez and, I guess, the devil, proceeded to stab Mary Louise Cannon dozens of times before slitting her throat. Detective Salerno was called to the scene and would remark that this was an act of pure rage. After consulting with his partner, Detective Carrillo, and going over the evidence, that included a bloody sneaker print, not enough to make a definitive match, but enough to make a connection. It was feared that the Valley Intruder was indeed just getting started, and they had no idea how right they were. On the next episode of The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow, law enforcement begins to make some significant headway, while the killer has a run-in with someone he believes is the only person who can stop his rampage: Jesus Christ himself. Plus, we arrive at the final level of Dante's hell, the level that contains the final 3 circles. That's next week on The Devil Within, Satan's Shadow.
The Devil Within is an EVO production, recorded live at Bel Air Studios in Los Angeles, California. Written and produced by Brandon Morgan, executive produced by Danny Abelson. For The Devil Within, I'm your host, Brandon Morgan.